tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So last week we talked about craving using the Buddha's core simile of burning. We talked about the burning discourse, the third discourse to the Kassapa brothers and their followers, the great fire-worshipping ascetics, where the Buddha says, mendicants, all is burning. The eye is burning, the ear is burning, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind are all burning. Burning with what? With greed, hatred, and delusion. We talked about the aggregates, the 5 aspects of our experience: form, feelings, perceptions, formations, and consciousness. That the aggregate, or khanda, literally means like a heap of fuel, a heap of firewood. So 5 burning heaps of firewood, 5 things that our attention fixates in a way where the fuel of grasping comes into contact with this aspect of experience, whether it's forms we see or the body we sense, feelings we have, the perceptions and stories we have of the world, and wakefulness or consciousness itself can be fixated and grasped at. And that grasping is like heat contacting a fuel source, and the pain we feel of loss, of grief, of not getting what we want, of getting what we didn't want, that things that hurt, feel as a kind of burning. So at the very end of the gathering last week, I was doing the closing prayer, and I ended up bringing in is talking about burning and realizing that, of course, wildfire, and we think of wildfire as a bad thing, but of course, wildfire around here in Northern California and in many parts of the world is, when done right, healthy for the ecosystem, right? And so now the colonial population here is waking up to a truth that the native population has known since time immemorial, which is that the grasslands and woods here need to burn regularly in order to stay healthy and in order to not be subject to the kind of destructive wildfire that can cause so much harm and damage and disturbance, and which, of course, the intensity of which, of course, the intensifying nature of which is, a result of climate change. But fire is, a natural part of every landscape. And so then the idea that's returning to popular consciousness of the controlled burn, or the intentional burn, or the cultural burn. When the English explorer Sir Francis Drake first landed at Drake's Bay near here, just down at Point Reyes, just down the coast, it was the first contact between the English and the Northern Californians, the Miwok and Pomo here. There had been some Russian contact sometime before, a little further north, but this was the first contact of Europeans to folks in this area right here. And he knew that there were people here because he saw the fires, and they were clearly intentional. They were small spot fires that the Miwok were burning. So I want to think tonight about about controlled burn as a simile, or as a development of the Buddha's ideas about burning and how we might think about this. In controlled burning, in a landscape like Northern California, which is quite lush, quite dry, our rainfall is seasonal. So we get a lot of rain in the winter, at least in a good year. And during the summer, it doesn't rain at all, mostly. And so the land gets quite dry, and we now have what we each year call a fire season between about August and November, where the risk of wildfire is quite high. And the risk has been made much, much greater by, you might say ignorance, but by quite wrong forest tending practices that the American government put into place in the mid-late 19th century, which was to prohibit burning. So, and prohibiting controlled burns was as much a product of the romantic ideal of the untouched wilderness, which was an ideal that that did not understand the role that indigenous humans have known humans to be in with the natural world for a very long time, right? That wild land is not wild because it's untouched by humans, as if humans are always, a harmful ingredient in an ecosystem. In an indigenous ecosystem, it's much more like a vast, gently tended garden. And the indigenous folks here, the Miwok and the Pomo and the Wapo and many others, all up and down this coast, certainly throughout Northern California, were tending the wild here, tending patches of tule, tending the berries, planting fruit trees, tending oak trees for acorns. There's a report of an indigenous visitor coming with a white ranger to Yosemite, one of our extraordinary and gorgeous national parks here, sort of the queen of the national park system. We think so anyway. And the ranger being so proud and saying, like, what do you think? Like, isn't it gorgeous? And the indigenous person saying, it's so messy. By which they meant, the leaves and the fallen branches haven't been burned for like 100 years. And so the ground is a tangle of underbrush and fallen branches and leaf fall. And of course, if you let the ground go like that, first of all, you can't find the acorns if you wanted to harvest them. And it's a terrible fire risk. And so there was both a romantic policy in the 19th century that thought of wilderness as an untrampled, unhuman affected land. So this is very much not an indigenous concept. This comes from, this partly comes from Europe, which was, so deeply settled so long ago that wilderness of the kind that you might find in the California Sierras was quite rare there. Just a few patches in the Alps and the Black Forest and other places where you might find a large stretch of forest without villages, but mostly there's not vast wilderness the way you find in North America in Europe. And so you might understand some of the romanticism coming from that amazement at finding this much open land. So there was that romantic ideal that was also a colonial ideal. And then just the the destruction of the native culture and the loss of the knowledge systems that really understood this ecosystem and understood how to burn the ecosystem for its well-being and the well-being of the humans that live here. So the result of this was vastly overgrown forests with thick, flammable undergrowth and forest tending practices that really didn't understand the land and the cultures they had taken charge of. So we come to the 21st century and climate change and increasingly hot summers, and we had a series of very intense fire seasons, between the late teens, 2015, to about 2020, around here anyway. And the big fires last year and this year are up in Canada. But for a series of years there, the West Coast experienced, as of course many of you know very intimately, a series of really catastrophic wildfires. We call them catastrophic mostly when they hit towns. Most of those wildfires were, the catastrophe in a certain way was more about air quality, that like it's actually good for those lands to burn, and a lot of them burned. Some of the biggest fires were out in, vast grasslands and forests that needed to burn anyway. But those were difficult years in terms of air quality and just keeping communities safe. And they woke they woke us up. They woke settler culture up to the reality of wildfire. And where I live here in Sonoma County, there was a whole resurgence in interest in controlled burning, and a lot of legislative work to make it legal again, or more, easier to do. And I think most beautifully, there were a number of initiatives all around the state, and I'm speaking just here as a Californian, but this is happening in many, many places here in North America and elsewhere, to go to the indigenous populations that are still here, the communities that are here that remember how to do this. And this is where the term cultural burning came from. And I'm proud that where I live in Sonoma County, there's been a lot of very engaged conversation and projects together with the local Pomo and Miwok communities to really tend the forests in a way that will both protect communities and bring the forests back to health. So controlled burning, as a healthy thing. All of that is the prelude for folks not local about controlled burns. And how might we think about this in relation to the Buddha's teachings then on burning? And the first, and I think most central way that I want to talk about this is in relation to, partly in relation to the difference between lay people's practice and monastic practice, and in relation to renunciation. So when the Buddha says that craving is a kind of burning and relates it to the senses, part of what he's talking about is how sensory contact gives rise naturally to pleasant and unpleasant and neutral Vedana, feeling tone or affect. And when not felt with mindfulness, that Vedana can very easily expand into or slip into or ignite into the emotional urge that we call craving or grasping, right? Both grasping and aversion, the urge to make more contact with something or less, right? More contact is like wanting, greed, lust, grasping. Wanting less contact with something is like, anger, fear, pushing away, resistance, rejection, like that. And neutral Vedana, right, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, tends to give rise to the habitual emotional tone of dullness, right? Neutrality giving rise to non-interest. And sometimes neutral can shift very, very subtly in one direction or the other, depending on your personality, right? If things are not dramatic, do you get kind of like antsy and frustrated and like aversive to that? Are you aversive to boredom? Or if things are slow and not dramatic, do you slip into the pleasurable, like, finally, everybody's leaving me alone, and it becomes slightly pleasant. So you can find the emotional response or the reactivity to any of the three kinds of Vedana, and it's all a kind of burning. And it's burning because attention is captured by the sensory contact. Whatever it is I'm paying attention to or has pulled my attention, there's a kind of heat there. And so when the Buddha is talking about this, certainly to the Kassapa brothers and to his primary audience, when he's talking about grasping, partly he's talking to his monastics who have entered into a renunciate lifestyle where they are, formally not engaging in sexuality and commerce particularly. So not raising families, not having sex, not using money and engaging in business and commerce in that way. And then the corollary to not using money is living very simply, not owning anything. So setting aside both commerce and ownership of anything. And so these two are the core renunciations: not having possessions, not using money, and not engaging in the economic trade, and then not engaging in sexuality, which is connected to raising families and being embedded in the world of family and caretaking. And those two things, of course, are completely interrelated. If you have a family, you have to take care of them and earn enough money, all of that. So one of the ways that the Buddha is talking about letting go of this burning that we talked about a little bit about last week is that the burning is partly connected to the non-monastic or lay life, where there's money and sexuality and earning and spending and caretaking of others in this material way. And to do this, you have to maintain some amount of participating in the ecosystem of wanting, right? You have to work. You have to want to work. You have to earn money and want to do that. If you're heading toward having a family, you have to have some relationship to sexual desire where you are acting on it, at least a bit in order to have a family, and sometimes a lot. This is the realm of desire in many ways, is the lay lifestyle. And so the Buddha partly gets to use burning as a metaphor for craving, and gets to give the teaching to completely give it up, partly to the monastics, right? You've given up sexuality and money, so you can really work on your impulses toward wanting and lusting and all of that. And you can let those go very deeply. For lay people then, what do we do with this teaching on grasping? Like, don't grasp at sights through the eye, And the paradigmatic example is physical attraction leading to lust and sexuality, procreation, perhaps, all of that, and the life just broadly of eros. How do we understand or feel into or think about the life of eros in relation to this teaching on burning? Because a straightforward way of hearing this teaching might be, that the Buddha is basically anti-eros, because to see the attractive person and want to continue to see them, to keep that sensory contact going and make more of that sensory contact and come into more contact of whatever kind, that's a kind of grasping, right? And so clearly that is a kind of grasping. What's wrong with that, right? And so partly for the Buddha, I think for us, it's really helpful to remember when he's talking to monastics and how we can understand those teachings as non-monastics. Because if you are not a monastic, you haven't taken vows of celibacy or vows of poverty or vows of simplicity. You might have a practice to be frugal, or to be, when we take the precepts, the monastic or the precept on retreat for sexuality, for instance, is not to move sexual energy, essentially, and at all with anybody, including yourself. And but when we're not on retreat or we're not monastics, we change the third precept to be not to commit sexual misconduct. So we really make it an ethical teaching, but it's not about not, engaging erotic energy. And so when we are lay people engaging with erotic energy or engaging with, just to keep broadening it, I'll sort of flip back and forth, but to broaden it to, commercial and economic life, like I'm moving money around, I'm trying to save up enough money for retirement or to, all the things. And it's hard to do that without nurturing in some way the feeling of wanting that money, right? I want a secure retirement, so I want to have enough investment to do that. So I'm not working, working the meditation circuit at 95. I mean, if I can, I'll be happy to. Please hang out with me for the next 40 years while we do this. But there's essentially a requirement that we cultivate a relationship with eros in lay life, and if we lose it completely, if we really set it aside, we can go into long seasons that are very retreat-like. You might have in your life had long seasons where you are, intentionally single or living very simply, not really working career, turning the gears of commerce or lust or any of those things. And you can, if you have the resources to do so, sometimes rest into, a kind of semi-monastic, life for a little while. But because you're not held by the monastic community, you're not living communally in that way, you have to go back to work at some point. And, you can certainly live, a celibate single life. Now it's much easier than many times before for many kinds of people to choose that life, even who are not monastics. But you still have to go to work at some point, a little bit, most of us. So I think the lay life requires some relationship with eros, some relationship with commerce, which in a certain way I'm going to lump in with eros. That might be dangerous. Some relationship with desire. So what do we do with that? Is it a kind of burning? It is a kind of burning. So I'm going to propose that that if monastic life, or even non-monastic, but life choices where you are significantly renunciate, like you're not looking for love in either the right or the wrong places, you're just not looking for it, you're settled into not pursuing the flame of eros in an interpersonal way, that you are protecting yourself from that particular burning a bit, right? And so if you're a monastic, you kind of go all the way with that protection, and that's its own discipline, not easy, as any monastic will tell you. But if you're not doing that, you're in lay life, you're partnered, or you're in some relationship to eros where you're more active with this quality of let's say, interpersonal desire, I'm going to call this a kind of controlled burn. So there's a kind of ecosystem or landscape of our psyche in the community, and we can see in the larger culture what happens when the energy of eros, of erotic longing, wanting connection, wanting sensual connection, we can see what happens when that longing is unmet or unsatisfied or channeled in toxic ways, in unhealthy ways, and that it can cause a wildfire if built up. Actually, just today or yesterday, saw an article that was about evangelicals who had been raised in purity culture to, to never have sex before marriage and to forswear, masturbation and really to think of sexuality as a sin, except in very, very, very specific circumstances, Christian, monogamous, straight marriage, etc. Within that narrow window, um, beneath the sheets with the lights off, whatever, right? And people coming out of that and even at like middle age and being completely confused, like really unable to relate to sexuality in any healthy way, and having to recover from that. And uh, it's not shocking, but heartbreaking to see how much, sexual abuse, for instance, um, uh, comes out of cultures that are sexually repressive, with the paradigmatic example being the church, um, but many, many other examples as well. And so if you don't, this is the controlled burn metaphor. If you don't figure out some way to burn accumulating fuel, it will eventually light on fire and cause a wildfire. And so what do monastics do? I think the monastics enter into a very fiery kind of discipline where there's a communal structure around the individuals that supports the renunciation of, of this entire uh, area of life. And renunciation is not simple. Like it doesn't mean like you just decide, okay, that's it, I'm celibate, no big deal. It's a big deal, and you have to work with it. And one of the monks I know said like, oh yeah, young men come in here. They're specifically talking about men, but it's true for everybody in different ways. They say, oh yeah, young men come in here full of fire for monastic practice. They love it. They're really into it. Their meditation is strong. They're serving the community. They're selfless. They're, passionate about the Dhamma, and that lasts about 7 years. And then it hits them, you know, and everyone has a hard patch in there where you're really like, what have I done? And what am I missing out on? And, how do I do this? I don't know if I can do this. And the intensity of renunciate practice traditionally is thought of itself as a kind of fire. So in the yogic traditions, this is called tapas. This is the heat of intense yogic practice. And one of the primary ways to get through that difficult patch and actually generate the heat necessary to burn through, the habits of craving and lust and wanting, is the intensity that you bring to your meditative practice. So the bliss of deep meditation, of concentration, so piti, rapture, lighting up the body with powerful energy with the breath is actually one of the best antidotes to, the 7-year itch, as it were. One of the amazing things about concentration, about samadhi, is that it can give rise to almost or beyond orgasmic kinds of states that can be controlled and learned and contained and cultivated. And this is one of the best ways to be a satisfied celibate monastic, is to be able to light up your body with extraordinary pleasure through the force of concentration. When concentration is lacking, everything is harder, including those states of mind which you may notice. Anytime you get overtaken with, wanting, lust, greed, all of those states, loneliness, not being able to bring the mind to silence and the body to a more pleasurable energetic state, makes those painful states so much more painful. So I think the monastics generate a kind of heat in their practice, in concentration practice, tapas, that helps to burn away those ancient habits. But for those of us not in those situations, you know, look around the world, like lust and greed for money, greed for money and sex and power kind of runs this place, and how do we deal with those energies in a way that's safe? So I think about lay practice, especially lay practice for dedicated practitioners, as a kind of controlled burn. It's not our path to renounce them completely. That's the monastic path. If you want to renounce them completely, do that. But if you're sticking around here in the lay world, for whatever reason, you have responsibilities, you have people to take care of, you like it, like I like it, I don't know, there's you're not done with it, right? So you keep going in it. Our path is not to try to eliminate then this burning, but to channel it in a way that it doesn't burn down the Palisades, or any town that you happen to live in, or the forest that you love. So how do we do this? I think the structures that we might think about for this, similar to the way that the monastic structure that helps bring monastics through, these powerful energies, formal structures really help. And so, in terms of lust, for instance, intimate, sensual, sexual longing, wanting, the formal structures, like marriage, have always been, fire breaks for, lust and wanting. They don't always hold, as you know well, but they can, right? They can structure a society so that those forces are at least, we try to channel them, right? And so you'll get messages like, yeah, keep it to your person, and then within your person, within you and your person, let it burn. And actually, okay, it's healthy actually if it burns there, and it doesn't hurt folks. And so even as we, I'm a little bit like, thank God, like, grow out of cultures of compulsory monogamy or compulsory straightness and, heteronormative marriage structures, etc. We're growing into different structures that similarly are trying to keep us and those we love safe in relation to this fire, right? So these are cultures of consent, or cultures of affirmative consent, or cultures of being a so-called ethical slut, right? Which was the great poly handbook of the 90s that me and my friends all cut our teeth on back in our salad days. I don't know why they're salad days. Why salad? I don't know what that's about. Is that because you eat it before the meal? Am I on to the main course right now? Like, I don't know. Any structure that is that creates a kind of normative ethics, right? That creates a structure that you can live into that will protect you from the worst of your impulses. This is a kind of controlled burns, right? So what do you do? Like, what is a controlled burn in the landscape, right? What makes a burn controlled? The main thing that it has is boundaries, right? If you want to do a controlled burn of a meadow, you cut a fire break on all sides, and then you light it from one side, you stay close to it as it burns, and you don't let it jump the fire break. That's what makes a burn controlled. Controlled burn is not entirely the right word, because if you've ever been around, like a grass fire, you don't control a grass fire. And in a way, you don't control any fire. You tend it. Anytime you've been with even a campfire, you're not controlling it. Like, fire is the most extraordinary, uncontrollable force. It's the paradigmatic, natural force that you don't control. You worship it, right? You feed it like a being. You pray to it. You make boundaries around it all the time, you know. Um, and so uh, so what we do, what a controlled burn in the landscape is that it's a burn with well-tended boundaries. So in our lives where we are burning with, lust, hatred, and delusion, um, what are the clear boundaries around those emotions so that they don't, burn out of control, right? So, if you're in a monogamous marriage, you respect that boundary and you don't create the harm that we call cheating, right? Before you do that, right, you go to your partner and you say, partner person, I want to, open our monogamy to a more poly kind of structure. I want to, have other lovers, and I want to do it in a way that's consensual, all of that. And your partner's like, I thought you'd never ask. What a great idea. Let's do it. And then now you have a consensual, polyamorous relationship, and you cut a new fire break together, right? You create, what are our agreements? You can do this and not that, or we each do this, and you get one Thursday a month to go out and play safely out in the world, right? That's your fire break. And again, you make a consent-based structure. Let's jump out of sexuality over to money for a minute. What would a fire break, in the economic world, be? I'm a layperson, I have a job, I need money to support my family, but I can also feel how more money helps me not just support my family, but do more fun things, right? If I get past just surviving, and I get more money, what do I get to do? I get to work less, I get to go on retreat more, I get to, I don't know, right? Um, uh, Upgrade the device, the whatever, and who knows, right? Retire earlier, give money away to help others, right? Like it doesn't have to be greed, personal greed. Like I could just, any number of times I've thought like, oh, I would be an awesome billionaire. I would give so much money to like really awesome people. Like they could hate me like they hate George Soros. Like, go for it. I would be happy to be um, a socialist billionaire for a short time, and then you're not a billionaire anymore because you gave it all away. So, bravo. But whatever your reasoning, right? So what are these fire breaks? And of course, the big cultural fire breaks, are things like regulations, corruption regulations, and bribery regulations. They're not really working very well nowadays, but we do have those, those things. Personally speaking, right? There are things like there's ways that I naturally restrain my wanting for more. Um, partly there are things like partly there are things just like social shame, like the way that wealth is actually kind of puts you in a very particular place in the culture. Um, but mostly when I think of the fire breaks on, on economic wanting, wanting of money, in the way that like, marriage and like consent dynamics in sexuality, at the moment those are very personal and you can change them a lot because we've gotten a very liberalized, sexual culture, at least around here. But they used to be very institutional, very government based. You could get arrested for breaking, letting your fire move over your fire break. More some people than others, and of course the whole thing was misogynistic for a long time. But the primary fire breaks that I'm thinking about economically really are still like cultural and government regulation type fire breaks, and there's not a lot of them right now. right? Because we're deep into the greed is good era. And, but, think your way over to like Scandinavia and, a fire break against excessive greed, is something like a 60% tax bracket or an 80% tax bracket for billionaires. You can make a lot of money, but you're going to give most of it away. And if you can't figure out how to do that willingly, we're going to force you, right? And in exchange, you get, Scandinavian cities, right? With like bike lanes and I don't know, all the good things. For me, all the good things start with bike lanes, flows downhill from there. So, so I'm going to pause there and just feel then the way that our life as lay people is not a process of trying to disengage from these fires, the fires of wanting, the fires of eros, and we can talk more about both of these, economics and eros. But it's not about deciding that we should somehow fully disengage, as if we even could in lay life, but more like how do we include in our practice the allowing and even celebrating of this burning in the ecosystem of our life in a way that's healthy, in a way that supports the wellness of the ecosystem and is well contained by appropriate fire breaks. Whether we have to dig them ourselves or we make ourselves subject to external forces that dig them for us and protect us, from the force of this tendable but never quite controllable fire. Of course, the absolute liberation of the Buddha is to fully be finished with burning. And so that's a mystery for another day.